Welcome to this online lesson on the French Revolution. Today we're going to be asking the question, did the mob turn to murder? And like all true historians, we're going to be going on sources that we can use, some of which date from the time of the events. The aim is to investigate the extent of violence after the execution of Louis XVI, an artist's impression of which we can see rather grisly on this screen. Why did the mob turn to murder? After the fall of the Bastille, the poor people took over Paris and the direction that the revolution was taking. Remember that the Bastille fell on the 14th of July 1789. In September of 1792, they had murdered 1,400 lords and priests of the First and Second Estates. Allegedly, they cut off their heads and pulled out and ate their hearts. Although how true this is and how much of it is propaganda remains to be seen. On the 21st of January of 1793, the people killed their king, held up his head and shouted, "Long live the revolution." We're going to be doing some more source work today, but we're going to take it a bit of a step further. There's going to be a greater emphasis in this lesson on the skill of inference, where you've got to try and draw information from the sources which is not immediately obvious. So you need to link it to what you already know about the topic and really read and study these sources carefully to get the information that you will need. The use of the sources is going to back up a final answer that you will write, which will be supported by information that you've been able to infer. Ultimately, we're going to be asking the question, why? We're going to look first of all at some accounts of Louis XVI's execution. Your task is to read both sources and then to answer these questions. Write your own summary of what happened at Louis's execution. You might want to combine the information that you get from each source here. Which source do you think is the more accurate account of the execution? Explain your choice, thinking about who wrote it and when. So let's have a look at source number 1. If you're struggling to read this, it's always worth bearing in mind that you can play this full screen and to select the high definition option so that it's as sharp and as clear as possible. This is an account of the execution by Henri Sanson, one of the king's executioners. It was written in 1793. Arriving at the foot of the guillotine, Louis XVI looked for a moment at the instruments of his execution and asked me why the drums had stopped beating. I came forward to speak, but there were shouts to the executioners to get on with their work. As he was strapped down, he exclaimed, "My people, I die innocent." Then, turning towards his executioners, Louis XVI declared, "Gentlemen, I am innocent of everything of which I am accused. I hope that my blood may cement the good fortune of the French." The blade fell. It was 10:22 a.m. One of the assistants showed the head of Louis XVI to the people, whereupon a huge cry of "Vive la nation! Vive la République!" arose and an artillery salute rang out, which reached the ears of the imprisoned royal family. Okay, that bit of French there, "Vive la nation" is long live the country or the nation, and "Vive la République" is long live the republic. And remember, a country that isn't ruled by a king is a republic. And now, source number 2. An account of the execution by Sanson's son, who saw the execution and wrote this in 1830. So quite a few years after the event. One assistant waited with a rope, while another said to him, "It is necessary to tie your hands." On hearing these unexpected words, Louis XVI made an involuntary gesture of repulsion. "Never!" he cried out. "Never!" and pushed back the man holding the rope. The other 3 assistants, believing that a struggle was imminent, dashed forward. That is the explanation of the moment of confusion interpreted after their fashion by the historians. What Sanson's talking about here is that it's since been alluded to that there was a bit of a scuffle or a struggle on the gallows and on the scaffold where the execution was taking place. And here Sanson's son is trying to explain that. "It was then that my father approached and said, in the most respectful tone of voice imaginable, 'With a handkerchief, sire.'" At the word "sire," which he had not heard for so long, Louis XVI winced. And at the same moment his confessor had addressed a few words to him from the carriage. And he said, "So be it, then, that too, my God," and held out his hands. Okay, pause the video here. You can reread those sources if you need to, and have a go at answering those questions. And yes, This is pretty tricky. These are some of the longest written sources that you might have encountered in history so far, and they even include some French. So do take your time over it and do your absolute best to draw out some information from these sources to get a sense of what happened at Louis's execution and tell that story. Pause the video now. Hopefully we've been able to describe the events of Louis's execution, the use of the guillotine, his hands being tied, and the reaction of the crowd. So which is the more accurate account? Well, certainly, source number 1 was written by someone who actually took part in the execution and was written much closer to the event. So that might make it the more reliable source. However, there are certain things in source 2 that I quite like in terms of details. In some ways it seems like a more honest account, showing that Louis XVI might have been brave, but he was also really scared. It also explains certain things that are not even mentioned in source 1, like the scuffle at the scaffold. And the idea of the private words, such as saying, "With a handkerchief, sire," as a final concession of respect towards a man who was about to be killed, which Sanson perhaps wouldn't want to admit to in his own account. For me, I think I slightly prefer account number 2, even though it was written so long after the events. But you'd have to treat it with severe caution. After all, Sanson is describing events that he may have witnessed, but he didn't actually take part in himself. And he's also recalling events from 37 years earlier. But remember, big moments like this in people's lives tend to be remembered for a lifetime. We're now going to have a look at another source to give us an impression as to what happened after. This is a very famous painting. It is called Liberty Leading the People, painted in the year 1830 by Eugène Delacroix. What I need you to do now is pause the video, and once you've done so, study the source and note down some of the things that you can see and try and make some inferences about it. Yes, I'm afraid there was a certain fashion for painting naked people at this time, but it's all done in a good artistic spirit. Try and get as many details as you can. Pause the video now. Alright, so here are some of the things that you may have noticed. Lady Liberty is holding a gun, suggesting that violence might be used. She's also carrying the flag of the revolution. I wouldn't expect you to necessarily know this, and it perhaps isn't all that clear on this painting, but she's also wearing a red cap. This is a red cap that represents liberty or freedom. It's based upon an old Roman tradition of giving a red cap to slaves who had been freed, and so it became a bit of an emblem of the revolution. You can see behind her a whole load of people with guns and spears. These are the people of the Third Estate, suggested by their slightly rougher fashion and clothes. There's even a boy next to her firing a gun in the air, representing the future. Before them we can see the dead bodies of members of the First and Second Estates. Probably more likely the Second Estate. One of them actually has no trousers on. This is sort of alluding to something that we'll come back to later on. In the background we can see the twin towers of a very famous building, Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, showing that this painting is set in Paris. So we can see Liberty, armed, leading the people in an armed revolt over the dead bodies of the First and Second Estate. And meanwhile, someone in a posh blue shirt is apparently pleading for mercy. We're now going to structure our inferences. First of all, just describe what you can see. You may have already done this, but just check that you've got the details that you need, and based upon some of those that I pointed out on the previous screen. Pause the video while you make sure you've got what you need. Secondly, what can you guess or infer from this source? This is where you look at information and you just take it that bit further, suggesting what it might represent or what it might show, rather than just the literal descriptions of, for example, saying there is a man in a top hat with a gun. Pause the video while you make your inferences. So you may have inferred that Lady Liberty is representing the freedom of the French people. You may have inferred that the little boy represents the future of France. You may have inferred that the people are from the First Estate at the back because of the clothes that they are wearing and because they look like they are winning in this fight. And you may have inferred that the people in the foreground are those rich people who they are fighting against. You may have also inferred or recognised that that is Notre Dame Cathedral in the background, suggesting that this is happening in Paris, which is the centre of the revolution. Let's take it one step further. What questions would you like to ask about this source? GCSE students are asked in their exam to ask questions of sources, so this is a good opportunity to practice this. And of course, because this is not a two-way dialogue, I won't be able to ask you what your questions are, and I won't be able to answer them now. But just think, choose a particular part of the source, or a particular detail. If it's something that you don't understand, what question would you ask to try and find out more? For example, if you didn't understand the point about the cap that Lady Liberty is wearing, you could note down, what is that hat that Lady Liberty is wearing and what does it represent? Even though I've already told you it represents freedom. So pause the video here while you note down at least one, but hopefully more questions that you could ask to find out more about this source. Perhaps you could even try and find out the answers. Pause the video while you do that. Okay, let's move on to the next section. I want you to imagine that you're in the position of these three people. Firstly, a priest of the First Estate. He's enjoyed paying no taxes before the revolution, receives 10% of the people's income, and knows that the king is no longer in control. A worrying time, no doubt. Then we have the position of a Marquis of the Second Estate. He has enjoyed special favours from the king. He has paid no tax either. And they think that they are better than the peasantry. And then we have the example of the revolutionary, someone who's actually taking part in the revolution. They're in the Third Estate and they have suffered many years of hardship, but they're finally feeling very powerful after the storming of the Bastille and the death of the king. And they've already killed many lords and priests to try and embed the revolution. So imagine that you are one of the above people, or perhaps you could imagine that you're all of them in turn. Note down some key facts about their life. Write a very brief diary entry reflecting how you feel after hearing about taking part in a day of revolutionary fighting. Perhaps if you're the priest or the Marquis, you've been on the receiving end of that fighting. Or perhaps if you're the revolutionary, you've been the one who's actually instigated it and started the fight. Your diary entry should only be about a paragraph long. That should be plenty. And then explain how you were feeling and why. This could be done as a part of your diary entry. So some sentence starters that you could use if you need to get an idea of how long it should be and how you could start off your answer. As a priest or a lord or a revolutionary, my life was, and you could describe what their life was like before the revolution. Now it is like, and you can describe how it's changed. And then you can explain how this makes them feel and why. Pause the video while you complete those tasks. Probably about 15 minutes will be enough. So hopefully we've picked up on the fact that the revolutionaries are finally starting to feel powerful and confident, whereas for the First and Second Estate this is a time of great fear and uncertainty, with many of them being killed. So what might they do? Well, it is true to say that some of them actually did become refugees and move to other countries, including the United Kingdom. This is our next source, and a very grisly one it is too, even if it's not particularly realistic. Historians who study this period in history would instantly recognise who this painting is by. It's by an English cartoonist called James Gillray, and he's got a very distinctive style of drawing very ugly looking people and very grotesque and disgusting scenes. If you find this a bit shocking, I can assure you it would have been equally shocking to people at the time. Source 4. A Little Supper in Paris, a family of sans-culottes refreshing after the fatigues of the day. Painted by British cartoonist James Gillray. Right, that term, sans-culottes, it means without culottes or without trousers. The culottes were the sort of knee-length trousers of very posh and fashionable styles that were worn by the Second Estate and the King in the period leading up to the Revolution. Therefore, the poorer people of the Third Estate who could not or would not wear the culotte style of trousers were referred to as the sans-culottes, which just literally means that they didn't wear that style of trousers. James Gillray, for comic effect, has decided to take this rather more literally though, and you'll notice that none of them are actually wearing any trousers at all. He's taking this very literally. What we're going to have to do here is to make some notes on what James Gillray's trying to portray here. Firstly, describe the scene. Secondly, explain what suggests that the source is exaggerated or unrealistically painted rather. And thirdly, as an extension, why might Gillray have painted an unrealistic picture of the revolution? There's several possible reasons for that, and you could maybe think of some of them. And yes, it is a grisly source, but I do urge you to remember that this is not actually a true event. It is a representation of what Gillray thought the revolution might be like. Pause the video here. Well, there's lots of details in here, so I'm going to sort of move around the picture in a clockwise direction, starting at the top left corner. Here we can see a piece of graffiti on the wall. It shows a typical revolutionary in a big tricorner hat who has cut off a lord's head. Then as we move around to the right, we can see some grisly body parts hanging in a store in the top of the house there. That's typically where people would keep their meat drying so that it became ham and so that it would last longer. Underneath, there's another piece of graffiti that says Louis Legrand. Louis Legrand being one of the nicknames for Louis XVI. Notice that he hasn't got a head. We can see a person wearing the knee-length culotte trousers has been hanged outside, and there are heads on spikes. At the table we can see an especially grisly scene of people being cannibals and eating bits of other people. Presumably these are members of the First and Second Estate, and indeed we can see a dead body underneath the table wearing those culotte-style trousers. They look very brutal, don't they? Not a very nice picture of them. Notice too that the man eating the eyeball is wearing one of these red Phrygian hats which represents the freedom of the people. He's also sitting on a big sack of money and jewels, representing the people taking the wealth of the First and Second Estates, and the king indeed. We can even see the children are joining in, with their daggers and knives, their revolutionary hats, and they're eating a basket of, well, I don't even want to think about what's in there. And lastly, we can see a cackling old crone, almost looking like a witch, just basting the dead body of a baby. Yes, this is about as gruesome as it gets, even though it's meant to be, in its own way, funny. So why is this source so exaggerated and unrealistic? Well, can you imagine a scene like this really taking place? I can't really. So why has Gillray done it? Well, perhaps he's trying to shock his audience. Perhaps he's trying to make a particular point about the brutality of the revolution that was killing so many people. Perhaps as well, he's trying to do it just as a kind of a dark humour as well. In other words, something that is really disgusting and therefore kind of funny as well. We laugh at it because we don't really know what else to do. But why might Gillray have painted such a picture? Let's not forget that Gillray was British. The British had been enemies of the French for a long time. Not only that, there was significant fear in Britain that revolution might spread to this country too. We'd sort of already had our own revolution with the English Civil War, but there was a fear that the inequalities in Britain that were making people angry might also lead to similar events. So Gilray's trying to show the revolutionaries as brutal and barbaric people who are even cannibals. So perhaps not a particularly fair representation of all of the revolutionaries. To finish then, we're going to put it together. The sources we have studied show that the revolutionaries turned to murder. Do you agree? Give reasons for your answer. Firstly, you would structure your answer by saying that you either agree or disagree with that statement. That means, do you agree that the sources that you have studied show that the revolutionaries turned to murder, or do you think that they show something else? You then choose one of the sources that we have studied. This could be one of the sources on Louis's execution, or it could be the James Gillray painting we've just looked at, or indeed the painting of Lady Liberty leading the French. A detail in the source that supports this is, and this shows that they did or did not turn to murder because. If you need to review these pictures, you can always flip back in the video, or I've included links in the description so that you can view them there. This source might be believable or reliable because. However, it may be unreliable because. Here you need to think about the accuracy of what you're looking at and whether you really trust this information. Again, this is tricky stuff. There are some people really struggle with being able to judge the reliability of sources. Think about all the dangers in the world at the moment caused by fake news and people just believing what they read. So if you can really master this skill, you'll be well placed for the rest of your life to recognise what's real and what isn't and take a much more critical account of things. So pause the video while you complete that answer. And I'm sure there are lots of different details that you could choose from, so I'm going to finish my narration there. Good luck with this last task, but when you're done, I'll say thank you very much for watching. I hope this has been useful and interesting, even if it has been a bit disgusting at times. And if you did enjoy it, then please consider subscribing to the channel and liking this video. Thanks very much, and au revoir.